Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Cameras and Coffee. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about things that I would like to see in my dreams included in the next generation of digital cameras, specifically DSLRs, because that's what I think about when I think of cameras, but some of these could be used in mirrorless as well. But before we get to that, I have two things that I need to discuss. The first is a correction from my previous Cameras and Coffee video, where I said I had seen a Sony A7S III body only listed on Amazon and B&H for $1,800. Quite rightfully was called out on that in the comments. And as the commenter pointed out, it will probably be around $4,000. And it's important for me, since I made a mistake, to correct it and explain what happened. Mistakes are fine as long as we own them and correct them to the best of our ability. So what happened was I went to Google and I searched for Sony A7S III price, and it took me to a listing for B&H and Amazon for $1,800 body only. And honestly, the A7 series look enough alike that I thought I was looking at the A7S III listing. It was for the A7 III. I just read the title, glanced right past I did not register the title correctly, and so I misread the listing for the A7 III and thought it was the A7S III. So explains why my understanding of the price was unrealistically low, and that's what happened. I apologize. The proper thing to do, of course, when you're a YouTuber and you make a mistake, is to correct it, wrap yourself in tinfoil, and then go climb in a microwave. So that's what I'm going to do after this video. And then the second thing is Steinbeck has an Instagram account now. So if you'd like to follow his adventures, we're going to shoot for 2 photos a day of him, give or take, and post photos. Steinbeck, that is not a look anybody wants from you. Try to post photos of his adventures out here hiking and things like that to Instagram. So there is a link to his Instagram account in the video description. Then the meat of today's video is I wanted to talk about some things I would like to see in the next generation of digital SLRs specifically, but some of these things could apply to mirrorless as well. One of the big things for me is I was thinking about this over the last few days since the Pentax announcement about their next flagship APS-C. And the thing that really stood out in that announcement to me was the prism that enlarges the image very slightly and that is very bright. And I think that's fantastic. A very bright prism is really nice. Enlarging it somewhat is also really helpful. One thing I would like to see in the viewfinders, it would be nice if Pentax would, for those of us who have glasses stronger than the built-in diopter, if they would make something that I could send in my glasses prescription to them, and then a couple weeks, a month later, I would get a little clip-on for the viewfinder that I could look through without needing to use my glasses on the viewfinder. And I made one of those for my Pentax K1, and it works very, very well, but only in landscape mode. I can't shoot portrait with it because I have an astigmatism. I assume that if I didn't have an astigmatism, I'd be able to shoot portrait just fine. But it'd be really nice to have something that rotates and just clips onto the viewfinder that comes straight from Ricoh and is meant to work exactly with the camera that I have with my prescription. Frankly, I'd pay a couple $100 for that. And I gotta imagine that would be a reasonably profitable add-on that they could sell. The excuse me. Going downward on the camera from there, you're going to notice one thing in here. I think what a lot of people sit down and say, a lot of people, camera makers, sit down and say, what should we do for our next generation? The brainstorming goes along these lines. What specs can we throw at this thing? Not What usability can we throw at this thing? What creative features could we throw at this thing? It's more of, it would be the equivalent of sitting down and saying, we're gonna reissue the next generation of this sports car. What are we gonna do? And everyone's saying, how many more cylinders can we put in the engine? How much more torque can we put down on the ground? Instead of asking, how can we make the interior more conducive to it being driven well and safely, things like that. So, and that's one of the things I think Pentax tends to do, is instead of saying, what specs can we throw under this thing's hood, they say, what can we do to make this a more enjoyable camera to use so that people can take better photos with it? Because realistically, every camera on the market today has amazing specifications. They are all better than every camera that was on the market a decade ago. They are all better than every camera that was ever available for film. So just in terms of what they can do out of the box. So the answer to what makes a camera better or worse than another is not specs. So continuing down the camera, the next thing I thought of that would be really awesome to have would be, and here's an overlay of what I'm going to read off of so you can see it as I'm reading it. If we look at this overlay, there's a black circle, and that is, consider that the optimal image circle that a lens will produce. Outside of that, it might still produce an image, but it would be, say, blurry. So if this is the optimal image circle, and if we look at I think it's blue. I have a black and white printout, so I can't remember the colors. The colors in the text correspond with the colors in the box. So the APS-C, FX, DX, 35mm film, full frame, etc. Aspect ratio in rough numbers is 36mm by 24mm. There's some slight fluctuation there, not a whole lot. That's about 864, it actually is 864mm square for full frame. Everything we're going to do here is based off of a full frame measurement. So that nestles into the image circle that way. Let's say that there were a 4x5 sensor that took up as much of the image circle as it could. 4x5 is a slightly better format in terms of using image circle. So a 4x5 sensor that could fit inside of this same 35mm lens image circle would be 34mm by 27mm. So a little bit shorter, but also a good deal higher, and it would deliver 918 square millimeters of sensor area, which is 1.06 times the full frame sensor area. So I think a really neat thing would be to have an option, at least, of some cameras in the next generation of digital cameras coming with a 4x5 sensor instead of the 2:3 aspect ratio in full frame and APS-C. 4x5 is a really enjoyable format to shoot. Most of the prints now that you would get, and historically, 8x10, 16x20, 20x24, that might not be it. 4x5, that's 6x4, so that's not it. But at any rate, 16x20 is about as big as most people go. It's by and large as big as I print here at home. But those formats are 4x5 uncropped. Now, by comparison, if you took a full frame sensor and you cropped it evenly on the sides down to 4x5, you actually only get 78% of the sensor area, which is 674mm squared. So you lose a decent amount of sensor area. Going to a slightly larger 4x5 sensor format would give a better use of the image circle. It would give more image area on the sensor, and it would functionally improve image quality. And with Instagram now having 4x5 as a very common and dominant format, that would be something very useful for Instagram influencers because it would allow them to shoot DSLR images, pull them up to Instagram without cropping them, just generally improve that workflow. Which brings me to my next idea. I've long said that cameras, SLRs, used to be system cameras. You'd buy the camera, and then there would be all of these things you could buy to customize it to the use you wanted. Camera makers used to sell darkroom equipment. They'd sell enlargers and reproduction machines and things like that. They'd sell slide copiers, of course, lenses, diopters, interchangeable prisms for high-end cameras, interchangeable focusing screens, film backs that held more frames, all kinds of different things like that allowed someone to say, here's the type of photography I want to do, and here's what I can buy that will work native with the camera that I own. Most of those capabilities are in some way, shape, or form built into the cameras now. But there is one significant limitation in digital cameras that I think would be, if the technological hurdle for this could be overcome, and that is a big ask in and of itself, would be really neat. And that is that the camera is limited in what it can do by what the sensor can do. I've long thought it would be really neat to be able to swap sensors in cameras without great difficulty. So let's say you had a camera and there were some way you could drop the sensor, and in the case of Pentaxes or other cameras that have in-body image stabilization, you'd have to also swap out the image stabilization unit and put in a different sensor. You could have the kit sensor, which would be just a good general all-around sensor like cameras come with today in general. What if you wanted to shoot sports and got a sensor with a native ISO of around 1600 or 3200 and a third as many megapixels? Well, if you have a 36 megapixel image sensor as your baseline, and now you go up to down to a 12 megapixel sensor, you now have images that are 1/6 the size. It's functionally like increasing your camera's buffer 6-fold. So what you can do then is swap in this fictional sensor that's smaller and with a higher native ISO for sports and reporting, and make better use of the camera's buffer. Okay, that's a neat idea. What about the opposite direction? What if somebody is out photographing real estate or landscapes or high-end portraits? Pop in a sensor that is so many megapixels, it can fill up the entire buffer with one image. And that gives you the maximum resolution that the camera could deliver. Okay, those are neat variations on a theme. What if somebody wanted to do creative black and white or astrophotography? A black and white sensor that only sees tones would allow you to do that creative black and white. It would also allow you to do astrophotography using different colored filters to create color images from astrophotography work without having to use a Bayer sensor that sees color and then taking that color away. You would get better results from your astrophotography, basically. Okay, fun idea. What about for Instagram? Why not have that 4x5 sensor be one that you can swap in and out of it? That would be a lot of fun. That would basically, camera makers didn't, like printer makers. Printer makers have never made money on selling a printer. When I sold printers for years, the printer makers were very open that every time they sold a printer, they would lose some hundreds of dollars just to sell it because they'd make that back up on the ink. Camera makers weren't making their bread and butter selling the cameras. Yeah, they'd either break even or make a little bit of money and maybe lose a little bit. It's a slightly different business model than printers, because printers consume a lot of ink and it's expensive but cheap to make. But camera makers would make a lot of their money selling those accessories. And so from a profit standpoint, from a corporate profit standpoint, it would be good to see camera makers offering some accessories that can't be built into the camera as a basic function, that users who need them would be able to purchase and that could drive additional profit. Recognizing these things are huge pipe dreams, I won't lie. And I don't think any of these things would ever realistically be delivered. But at any rate, or for Pentax, another idea for Pentax, they have the Astro Tracker built in where the sensor can move to track stars. What if Pentax were to sell an Astro Tracker unit that could communicate like the Vixen or the Ioptrons that I use, that could move the cameras, communicate with the camera, and then the Astro Tracker unit and the sensor could move in combination to allow exceedingly long Astro tracked images with really great accuracy, even if the Astro Tracker isn't aligned perfectly. That would be awesome. So at any rate, I think one thing that camera makers, it seems looking from the outside in that camera makers are thinking, we need to make our profit on the cameras, and we need to make it on the lenses. And we can do that by competing with ourselves for tons and tons of market share by throwing a ton of cameras at the market and a ton of lenses at the market and just assuming consumers are bottomless money bags. That generally seems to be the business model of many camera companies. And what I would advocate is that a better business model is to say, let's make a quality product that is enjoyable to use, delivers good images, and can be expanded and made more versatile specific to the user's needs. If the user needs to make 4K video, how about a sensor that's a 16:9 format that can be put in specifically for 4K video? Somebody wants to shoot Foveon or CCD, people still like shooting those things. Why not? The question, really what this begs the question of is, what creative ways can camera makers find to expand their offering in a way that is unique to their system and gives them a unique offering in the market? Because realistically, the majority of camera makers are all going mirrorless, and all the mirrorless cameras are just a big specs race where the makers are just saying, oh, you can do that, well, me too. Cameras have become one of the quintessential Me Too industries where functionally there's no real difference between the different makers' images. Sony has really nice lenses. Canon has some decent sensors, good sensors on their high-end cameras. Nikon's got good sensors on their high-end cameras. They also have great lenses. Canon has great high-end lenses. Okay, so we're talking about three companies that have great sensors and great high-end lenses and mirrorless camera offerings. The only difference between them is what super high-end specs set them apart. And increasingly, the answer to that is not a whole lot. Me too. All of the camera makers are saying, that guy can do it? Yeah, me too. Sure, me too. It's exactly the way that the construction industry that I worked in for the last 15 years was. You'd have the client saying, we need this thing built or fixed or whatever. And a whole bunch of contractors would come up and say, I can do that. And then other people would say, yeah, me too, for $1 less. That's not an industry that drives creativity or innovation. So one of the reasons when I say this would be something I'd like to see in Pentax cameras is because, frankly, they're one of the few companies that is actually coming up with innovative ideas that are saying, what can we do with our cameras that's different than just throwing specs onto them? Make them usable, make them enjoyable, make them expandable. The camera industry, a lot of camera industry watchers are saying the only way that the camera makers are going to survive is if they start outsourcing a lot of their components to third-party makers, and then Nikons and Sonys and Canons and all of them end up using the exact same in-body image stabilization system, which would be great for future repairs, don't get me wrong. But it also means that increasingly every camera under that scenario would just become the exact same thing under the hood with a different logo on the outside, similar to the way that Cosinas were the Canon T60 and the Nikon FM10, the Vivitar 2500, the Phoenix P1, the Cosina C1, the ProMaster 2500. Fundamentally, those are all the same camera under the hood. They're fine cameras, not really exciting. That's the risk that the photography industry, the camera industry becoming a Me Too industry poses. They're all the same. They're not really all that exciting. If that happens, if that does come to pass, that sort of scenario, then realistically the camera maker or makers that are in the best place to survive long term are the ones that are doing something that is creative and who can also communicate to the consumers that what they're doing is creative and why it's of a benefit to them. So there we go. So those are some things I would like to see in the next generation of cameras. A few creative ideas, but more importantly, and I think the end, what I'm really going for there, is a creative way of getting the camera to work with the photographer, but also more importantly, being able to communicate that to potential customers. Because without being able to communicate to them, Rico, this is directed at you specifically, people aren't going to buy it. People aren't going to want to buy it. People have to understand why they should want to buy that specific gizmo and how it's going to make their life better. It has to be communicated and articulated in a way that will translate customer interest into customer spending. So, at any rate, I guess maybe the last thing I would want to see out of the next generation of digital cameras is better marketing from the companies that have historically lacked in that area. So anyway, this was Cameras and Coffee for, it's today Tuesday, I think that's right. It's kind of hard to know what day it is when you're between jobs. So we'll see you at the next one, and have a wonderful day, everybody.